Good morning. Thanks for joining us for the Food Safety Modernization Act Preventive Controls Rule Fully Covered Facilities webinar. We are pleased to have Dr. Dicaprio from the University of California, Davis with us again for another webinar, along with Stephanie Smith from Washington State University. And we're going to get to the webinar presentation shortly, but first I'm going to go over a few quick housekeeping items. And just to let you know, we're going to turn the video off during the presentations, but we'll come back on during the question and answer sessions. We just want to let you know that there are faces behind the voices. So I will stop video and continue on with our introductions. So my name is Megan Donovan. I will be your host today. I am the education specialist here at the CCOF Foundation. And behind the scenes today, we have Larissa Hernandez providing technical assistance. She'll be the one fielding questions when they come in and may hop on as an alternative host if any technical issues arise. The CCOF Foundation is pleased to collaborate with our partners to host today's webinar. Guided by the wisdom of our farming roots, the CCOF Foundation unites the organic community to advance organic agriculture. We offer intentional education, financial support, and growth opportunities for organic professionals. We also wanted to acknowledge that today's webinar is supported through a food safety outreach program grant from the USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture. Please note the contents of the webinar do not necessarily represent the official views of the USDA. And also note, this webinar is not providing legal advice. This is the third webinar in our four-part FSMA 101 for Organic Food Processors series. If you missed the first two webinars, visit the CCOF website for links to recordings. And if you're having difficulties connecting to the webinar, if you can't see or can't hear, please call our office for support at 831-423-2263. Press 0 for the operator and someone will help you connect to the webinar. And finally, we're going to do a quick Zoom tutorial. I know most folks are probably Zoom experts at this point, but Zoom can be a little nuanced, so we'll just do a quick review. To see the Zoom webinar controls, move your mouse over the image of the shared screen. If you're in the full screen viewing mode and would prefer to view the webinar in a window, click on the View Options tab at the top of the shared screen and select Exit Full Screen Mode to exit full screen. Throughout the webinar, we will stop from time to time for questions and answers. To send in questions or communicate with our webinar staff, click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the shared screen. The question and answer box will pop open. Write your questions or comments in the field at the bottom of the box and click send. If you would like to send your question anonymously, check the send anonymously box to the left. Note, we won't be using the chat function for this webinar, so if you have any messages or need to connect with webinar staff, just send it in through the question and answer box. And feel free to send questions in at any point during the webinar. We will collect them and then address them when we get to the question and answer breaks. At the end of the webinar, an invitation to take our webinar evaluation survey will pop up. To take the survey, click on the link and answer a few quick questions to help us improve our offerings. As a final reminder, today's webinar is being recorded. We will send a link to the recording along with a PDF of the slides to all webinar registrants. And just so you know, we have a really good group of folks in the crowd today. So wanted to acknowledge that we're going to try to get to as many questions and comments as possible, but wanted to apologize in advance if we don't get to your specific question and encourage you to follow up with us after the webinar. So thanks again for attending. And with that, I would like to introduce our lead trainer. Dicaprio is an assistant specialist in cooperative extension in the Department of Food Science and Technology at the University of California, Davis. Her expertise is in microbial food safety with an emphasis on foodborne viruses. And joining Erin today are our Washington project partners. Dr. Stephanie Smith from Washington State University is here this morning. And we were, I know in the marketing materials, we noted that a representative from the Washington State Department of Agriculture organic program would be attending, but unfortunately they couldn't attend today. So we just have Dr. Stephanie Smith. And she will be online to answer any Washington specific questions. So with that, I will turn things over to Erin.
Thanks, Megan, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining today. So topic for today is going to be fully covered facilities under the Food Safety Modernization Act, or FSMA Preventive Controls Rule for human food. If you are able to join any of our previous webinars, we kind of went through the different categories under which a food processing facility might fall under these new FSMA regulations. But today we're going to focus in on those facilities that are going to be fully subject to the requirements of this Preventive Controls Rule for human food rule. And so just to frame what we're going to be covering today, we'll go through the general requirements of a fully covered facility. We'll talk about the components of the food safety plan. So a fully covered facility is required to develop and implement a food safety plan. We'll spend a little time getting into the nuance of conducting a hazard analysis. This, for many folks new to the food industry, can be a major challenge and hurdle. There are whole courses on hazard analysis, but my goal here is to give you some tools to help you start educating yourself and point you to resources that might be helpful in that hazard analysis process if you're not familiar. And then we'll end just talking a little bit about the implementation of food safety plans and kind of what to expect if you're getting an inspection for these preventive controls for human food requirements. And so just to start out, we have a poll for the participants. We want to get a sense of what the business you're affiliated with processes, so what you're making. This is not an exhaustive list, but can help us, start a conversation within the group, get a sense of what folks in Washington are working on. So we'll just take a couple minutes here. Seeing some others not applicable. I'm going to go ahead and end right here and share those results. So a couple of folks working on jams and jellies, baked goods, dried fruit, vegetables, or herbs. And so those would be what we consider low-risk food categories. And if you're just starting out, dabbling in starting a food business, these are things that can be produced under cottage food law. I'm curious what those products would be. But, I think we'll get into a little bit about how the Preventive Controls Rule would kind of impact your processing of these different products here today. And to give just the basic framework of who is covered by this particular rule, all facilities that manufacture, process, pack, or hold human food are covered by the Preventive Controls for Human Food Rule. In the last webinar, we covered the modified requirements for qualified facilities, so a business that grosses less than $1 million in annual sales is eligible to be one of these qualified facilities and would have modified requirements under this particular rule. For facilities that have sales over that $1 million threshold, adjusted for inflation, the full requirements of the Preventive Controls for Human Food Rule will apply. So today we're going to go through the general requirements, and I'll note here that there's a full 2.5-day training course that goes through more specifics. And just so you know, through this grant in the future, we'll be offering this course. Some of you may have already attended it or heard of it, the Preventive Controls Qualified Individual course. So we're not going to be able to go through, a ton of details here today, but really, the goal is to kind of ground everyone in what the general requirements are, give some of those tools for hazard analysis and how to build these food safety plans. For a business that's fully subject to the Preventive Controls for Human Food Rule, the full requirements under 21 CFR Part 117 apply. So that is the Preventive Controls for Human Food Rule. These businesses are required to implement good manufacturing practices and other prerequisite programs that include sanitary operating procedures. So this is one of the criteria, the requirements that also applies to facilities that are qualified facilities. So those grossing less than $1 million annually also have to follow and implement these good manufacturing practices as well. In contrast, fully subject facilities, in addition to that, also need to develop and implement a food safety plan. A requirement, a very critical piece to that food safety plan, and really the foundation of that plan, is conducting a hazard analysis. Fully covered facilities, of course, will also need to register with the FDA and will be subject to inspection. And so in Washington, the Washington Department of Ag will be conducting these inspections for preventive controls for human food compliance. So because conducting that hazard analysis and controlling hazards is such a critical piece of this particular regulation, I just wanted to go back and define the 3 general types of hazards that can occur in food and lead to foodborne illness. The first category are physical hazards. These would be items like glass, metal, bones, wood that could inadvertently end up in a food product and cause damage to the mouth or digestive tract if ingested. Chemical hazards include allergens. The big 8 allergens are shown here. So these are the 8 allergens that are required to be on labels here in the US. Other countries have more extended allergen lists, but here, milk, eggs, peanuts, tree nuts, fish, crustaceans, wheat, and soy are the allergens that need to be on labels and controlled for in a food processing business. Other chemical hazards could be chemicals used in processing or sanitizing. It might be a food additive that's inadvertently overdosed in a food product. So beyond allergens, kind of the more typical things you would think of being a chemical hazard also fall in this category. And then the last group of hazards are the biological hazards. So this group includes microorganisms transmitted by food, which are pathogenic. And this includes types of bacteria, viruses, as well as parasites that can cause illness in humans if ingested. And so the Preventive Controls Rule for Human Food requires food processors to identify these hazards that can impact the safety of their products. And if one of these hazards is considered reasonably likely to occur in that particular product, the manufacturer is then required to implement a preventive control to minimize the risks associated with that particular hazard. So I just want to point out here as well, there are numerous potential sources of these hazards. Some might be associated with the ingredients used in a product. Eggs, for example, known to be contaminated with a bacteria salmonella that can cause illness. That's just one example. Other hazards can be introduced from the processing environment itself. So this could be microbial contaminants that become resident in a food processing facility. This could be physical hazards. If you're using any kind of metal mixing equipment or pumping systems where there's metal on metal contact, you could have metal shavings and a physical hazard introduced. And another really important source of these hazards are people. So if we're sick, we can be shedding some of these microbial pathogens and inadvertently contaminate foods. There's also been some instances where people are cross-contaminating products with allergens. So, one example, someone was eating Cheetos in the break room, cheese there, dairy, allergen, goes back on the processing floor, and then there's allergen cross-contact from that worker and a non-allergenic food source. So just to kind of think about these different sources of hazards in your production environment and how they can impact the safety of the products you're producing. The Preventive Controls for Human Food Rule is based on developing a risk-based preventive control system for food safety hazards. So by applying a systematic approach, you're able to identify the most likely hazards to impact a particular product and develop a system to prevent these issues or risks associated with food safety in your products. So these preventive controls, they work in conjunction and are supported by other programs like good manufacturing practices. So really important if you're one of these fully covered facilities to make sure you're implementing, these very, basic good manufacturing practices, because they serve as the foundation for food safety programs. So your preventive controls are a big piece of the food safety puzzle, but without implementing these prerequisite programs, you're not adequately addressing food safety in your operation. So this rule aims to have food processing facilities build a food safety system. So these good manufacturing practices and your sanitary standard operating procedures are really the base level things that must be done to mitigate food safety risks. And as I mentioned, they serve as the foundation for this food safety program. So we'll have a fourth webinar that focuses on good manufacturing practices, but generally these GMPs include things like making sure your employees wash their hands, that your equipment and facility is routinely cleaned and sanitized, things of that nature. After these GMPs, other prerequisite programs are implemented, the hazard analysis is really the next most important piece of the food safety system. And this hazard analysis is a systematic review of your process that highlights all the potential hazards in your product and process. Then these hazards are essentially ranked in terms of whether they are a reasonably foreseeable risk. The weight of the human health impact also goes into that hazard analysis, hazard determination. Some of these hazards you identified, they may be controlled by GMPs or other prerequisite programs, but others may be elevated and require that you implement some type of preventive control to reduce the risk associated with that particular hazard that you've identified. There are 4 basic types of preventive controls that can be implemented to control hazards. This includes process controls. If you're familiar with the HACCP system, under that scheme, these are called critical control points. And these include things that you do in the facility to control a hazard. A pretty common example is thermal processing of a food product, heat treatment to inactivate pathogens in a particular product. Sanitation preventive controls are those that control for hazards in the environment that may cross-contaminate food products. So typically a sanitation preventive control would be required if you're working with allergen in your facility and you have some products that contain that other allergen, others that do not contain that particular allergen. You would need to have a cleaning and sanitation program to mitigate the risk of allergen cross contact in the facility. Another example would be if you have a ready-to-eat product that's going to be exposed to the environment after processing. And in that case, you may flag bacterial environmental pathogens as a hazard. And in that case, you would need to implement a cleaning and sanitation program to minimize the risk of those bacterial pathogen harborage sites within your facility. Allergen preventive controls are primarily related to ensuring that allergens are on the label that are applied to products that contain that allergen. And so that could include, checking labels that come into your facility, ensuring the allergen is labeled there. And then also, at the endpoint, making sure the product that contains that particular allergen got the appropriate label applied. Supply chain preventive controls are those that require supply chain controls are employed when there is a hazard associated with an ingredient that's coming into your facility, but you're relying on the supplier of that ingredient to address the hazard. You're not necessarily doing that in-house. And so you need to have control documentation from that supplier that they are indeed controlling for that particular hazard. The hazard analysis, the preventive controls, and all other documentation related to monitoring, verifying, and corrective action related to implementation of those preventive controls make up what's called the food safety plan. And then the final piece of that plan is a recall plan. And this recall plan outlines the procedures to be undertaken in a scenario where a food product needs to be recalled. And so these recall plans are required for a food processor that's identified at least one hazard that requires a preventive control. And so for facilities that are fully covered by the preventive controls for human food rule, a food safety plan is required under this particular regulation. And so there are certain components of this food safety plan that have to be included. So a hazard analysis must be included in the food safety plan. There are training courses on hazard analysis and lots of templates available for conducting a hazard analysis. I'll point you to some of those tools today, but certainly there are, other useful resources out there beyond what I'm going to be sharing here today. At a minimum, the hazard analysis would be, the one piece that's going to be required in the plan. So at a minimum, you have to have this hazard analysis. If when you conduct your hazard analysis, if there's at least one hazard that is identified as requiring a preventive control, the other sections in this blue box are also going to be required. I will say it would be very rare to have a food product that does not have a hazard that requires a preventive control. I think the only product that I've seen is vinegar, and how, depending how that vinegar is being produced, there may or may not be a hazard that needs a preventive control. So just in general, I would operate under the assumption that you're going to have all of these other sections in your food safety plan as well. The preventive control must be identified within the food safety plan. So if you, flag a particular hazard, you need to have a defined preventive control for that hazard. And an important piece of that preventive control, depending on the particular type, is validation studies to support that particular control that you're employing does in fact mitigate the risk associated with the hazard you've identified. These validation studies are required for process preventive controls, but not necessarily for the other types of preventive controls. So again, if you're familiar with HACCP and critical control points, you know that you have to show documentation showing that those critical control points are in fact controlling that hazard you've identified. A recall plan is also required if at least one of the hazards that you identified requires a preventive control. Additionally, the food safety plan has to include the procedures for monitoring any preventive controls, verification procedures to ensure that those preventive controls are being implemented as intended, and corrective actions. So corrective actions are what is done if those critical or if those preventive controls were not implemented. So if you didn't meet a critical limit on one of your process controls, for example, what's going to happen with that product? What did you do to fix that issue in your facility? Other information that's useful to include in the food safety plan is a facility overview, laying out who's on the food safety team, a written description of the product and the process, as well as a flow diagram. So these are useful, but not necessarily required in the regulatory language to be included in the food safety plan. So the food safety plan must be specific to a facility, and the preventive controls need to be specific to a product and a process. And so I'll just point out here that there are a lot of consultants that will develop a food safety plan or a HACCP plan for you. But I will say that some folks that I've talked to, especially smaller processors, have had some troubles working with a consultant because that person is not working in the facility. They don't have a great understanding of the product and process. So I just put that out as a disclaimer. If there's someone internally that can take on the responsibility of developing the food safety plan, then I think that's a way to get a more useful, comprehensive food safety plan. So like products can be grouped if the hazards and control are managed generally in the same way. So if you have very similar products that only have slight variations in formulation, you may be able to just group those products because they have the same hazards and the same controls that are going to be handled in the same way. But your food safety plan does have to address all the biological, chemical, and physical hazards that are associated with your product and process. The format of the plan is flexible. There's no standardized template or forms that you have to use. That being said, there are some really useful templates that are available out there to use. And I'll point you to where you can find some of those later on today. You can also use electronic records, but I'll just say that those must adhere to certain standards that ensure that those documents can't be altered after their original generation. And also, I'll mention this later as well, but the food safety plan must be created by a preventive controls qualified individual. So I'll define what that preventive controls qualified individual or PCQI is, and the requirements for that person in the development of the food safety plan. So I'm going to walk through the main organizational sections of the food safety plan, giving a bit more detail about each. And there are examples of food safety plans available. And I think it's a good practice to go seek out some of those examples to get a sense of the kind of information that needs to be included. So this first section that's listed here, this is the optional information. But this information is very helpful for the food safety team itself. So the folks that are putting together the food safety plan. It can also be really helpful for management, as well as for inspectors that are coming into your facility, because it gives some context to your entire operation and also your food safety plan. So the information you might consider including is a facility overview. So this would be information on the square footage, the products made in the facility, your operational hours, number of staff, and also your food safety team. A product and process description is also very helpful. So this gives a written description of what you're making, how you're making it, how it's packaged, and how it's stored. A flow diagram is also very helpful. So this is kind of a graphic depiction of that product and process description. And this gives really step-by-step details of the entire process of making the product, from receiving of ingredients and packaging all the way to final storage and shipping. And so this flow diagram is a tool that I recommend to people when they're conducting their hazard analysis, because it makes it really clear, what steps also need to be included in that hazard analysis. So each step in the process, so from receiving to final packaging, each one of those steps needs to be addressed during the hazard analysis. And so having that flow diagram can help facilitate that process. So the next section is the hazard analysis, which is critical because it drives decision-making for preventive controls that need to be included in the food safety plan. So I'm going to spend a bit more time talking about hazard analysis here before I go into the other sections of the food safety plan, because it is so critical. So as I mentioned, from each step in the process flow, from receiving ingredients to final product leaving the facility, you need to determine if there are potential hazards at each one of those steps. So once you've identified hazards, so you would need to be evaluating potential biological, chemical, and physical hazards at each one of those steps. You need to do an evaluation to determine if that particular hazard you've identified requires a preventive control to be implemented. So how severe and likely that hazard is one parameter that you would evaluate. If that hazard is severe and likely, so when I mean severe, does it have a significant impact on human health? And likely, is it reasonable to assume that this pathogen might be of concern at this particular step in that flow diagram? Then kind of the next assessment that needs to be done is whether the prerequisite programs like good manufacturing practices adequately control that hazard. And then if that hazard is not being addressed by good manufacturing practices, then that hazard likely will require a preventive control to be implemented. So it can be really challenging to determine what kinds of hazards are likely or reasonably foreseeable to occur in different products. So an important first step in conducting the hazard analysis is gathering data. And so you can get this data or information from searching for previous recalls or outbreaks in products like your own. You could also find information in scientific reports or publication, as well as other types of guidance documents. When you're gathering this data, it's important to not only consider products exactly like yours in your search, but other products in related categories or even raw ingredients that you're using. So I'm going to walk through a few examples here just to point you to an approach that can be used to gather some useful information. Both FDA and USDA post recall information on their websites. So you can fairly easily search by food category there for recalls and outbreaks. And that's often a really good first place to start. And so I have a couple examples here. Again, it's not going to capture a huge diversity of products, but I just wanted to give you a sense of how you might walk through this process. And so the first example I have is ice cream. So I'm a new ice cream producer, and I want to understand what kind of hazards may be associated with ice cream products. So if you search for recalls in the FDA database, you can see there are a number of recalls associated with ice cream over the last 5 years or so. It's really important as you're looking at these recalls to see what the particular hazard was that caused that recall. So you can start to pick out trends in products. In the outbreak or in the recalls I have listed here, you can see in 6 of the 7 outbreaks, Listeria Monocytogenes, which is a bacterial foodborne pathogen, was the reason for these recalls. There was one other recall where pathogenic E. coli was the cause of the recall. This is another foodborne bacterial pathogen. So given this data as a new ice cream processor, I would certainly be considering Listeria monocytogenes as a hazard needing a control, and likely also pathogenic E. coli due to its health impact. And so I also want to point out here that recalls are not necessarily always due to people getting sick. And so in these examples, the recalls were initiated because regulatory agencies did product testing and found these pathogens in these particular ice cream products, which initiated the recall. An outbreak is when we have people that are actually getting sick from consuming a product. Outbreaks are defined as 2 or more people becoming ill with the same causative agent after consuming the same food product. Outbreaks of human illness, of course, also lead to recalls. But when I'm gathering data, I would be looking for both recalls and outbreaks associated with a similar product to my own. And so for ice cream in particular, there was a large-scale outbreak that occurred in 2015 due to Listeria Monocytogenes. This was linked to a large-scale producer of ice cream, and they actually had outbreaks linked to 2 different production facilities. So if there is an outbreak like this in a product that is similar to yours, a best practice would be to try and dig in and find out what went wrong for this particular processor that led to the outbreak. And oftentimes, when there is an outbreak, you can find the FDA Form 483 or an inspection report from those outbreak investigations. And that'll give you some details on what the FDA found in their investigation. In this particular case, the ice cream manufacturer had positive product and environmental swabs for Listeria monocytogenes. However, the corrective actions they implemented, so increased cleaning and sanitation, weren't effective to mitigate this hazard. So it's really important to see what goes wrong in these outbreaks. So, these mistakes aren't going to be repeated. In this case, Listeria monocytogenes, this is an environmental pathogen that can actually build up residents in a food processing facility. And so this facility, they had this pathogen in their freezer as well as drains in the facility. And although the facility was aware of this issue and tried to make corrections for that, they weren't effective in controlling the hazard, and therefore people got sick and their facility was ultimately shut down. So another resource that I'll point out here is a really, really useful guidance document from the FDA. And so this resource lists potential biological, chemical, and physical hazards for different product categories and processes. And so you can see for ice cream, so just, regular ice cream, no inclusions, no added nuts, things like that, that the FDA has flagged pathogenic E. coli, salmonella, and Listeria monocytogenes as potential hazards in those products. So this guidance document, in the lack of, your own personal experience or recall outbreak data can be really helpful to kind of point you in the direction of what's an inspector going to consider a hazard in this particular product that you need to control. Just another example here, refrigerated soup. Oftentimes, refrigerated products can have a little less regulatory stringency than other shelf-stable products. However, temperature abuse and refrigerated products can really cause significant hazards. So, for a product that's heated and then going to be refrigerated, a really important control step is that cooling process. So cooling in rapid fashion reduces the risk of microbial pathogen growth. So we have some types of bacterial pathogens like Clostridium perfringens, which was the cause of this particular outbreak, that can form what are called bacterial spores that are very hardy, resistant to high cooking temperatures. So the spores won't be inactivated by high temperature. In a product like soup that's heated to a boiling temperature, these spores are going to remain. And if the product is cooled down really slowly, these spores can germinate into a vegetative bacterial cell that can then multiply in a food product and produce toxin. And so, if I was making refrigerated soup, I would search for outbreaks, recalls in that product, but probably also refer back to this FDA hazard guide. And you can see for refrigerated soup that Clostridium perfringens, the cause of that outbreak I just mentioned, is on this list, as well as 2 other kinds of spore-forming bacteria, Bacillus cereus and Clostridium botulinum in these products. And then there are 2 other bacterial pathogens flagged, Salmonella and Listeria. So these both are considered environmental pathogens, so bacteria that can build up residence in a processing facility. And these are hazards that need to be addressed in a product that is re-exposed to the environment after it's gone through a kill step. So if this soup is being produced in a large batch, it's then going to be cooled down, exposed to the environment prior to packaging, then we would also flag these particular pathogens. Another quick example is just a frozen entree here. I think there's with frozen foods, we've seen some recent outbreaks in frozen foods. So just to be clear, these bacterial pathogens, they are not killed by freezing. So freezing isn't a kill step. So just keep that in mind if you're producing frozen products. So in rice in particular and in pasta, Bacillus cereus is a spore-forming bacteria that's very common in grains, and we see it cause a number of outbreaks in foods that contain rice and pasta and aren't cooled in rapid fashion. So again, Bacillus cereus forms spores that are very resistant to high heat. So the cooking isn't going to inactivate this particular pathogen. If the rice or pasta is cooled slowly, that spore can germinate. The vegetative bacteria will grow and produce toxin. And this particular bacteria produces a very heat-stable toxin. So even if you reheat these products, you're not going to mitigate that toxin in the product. And so for frozen, ready-to-eat products, certainly this particular bacteria is of concern, as well as many others that are flagged here that may, not necessarily be controlled by a post-freezing kill step. So again, this hazard guide is really useful for helping to frame what hazards you would want to flag in your product. And next, I just wanted to give a quick example of a product that had a chemical hazard identified. So all the tables from that guide I just showed, those were all biological hazards, but there are also chemical and physical hazards that can occur in some of these products. So for chocolate, just an example here, you can see heavy metals, unapproved colors and additives, and natural toxins being flagged as potential chemical hazards. So this is a high value product that's produced outside of the US. And so there's different environmental and food safety standards in other countries. There may be issues with economic adulteration as well. And so this would likely be a case where you would have a supply chain preventive control, making sure that whoever you're sourcing that chocolate from is following, the best environmental food safety standards. And you would probably also be doing some kind of product testing to make sure these hazards aren't present. And then finally, I'll just end with an example of a physical hazard. So this is a ready to drink carbonated beverage. And I just want to highlight here this glass hazard. So anyone that's packaging in glass, you're going to be flagging glass as a potential physical hazard. So you need to have a glass management plan in your facility if you're packaging in glass to reduce the risk of that glass glass hazard reaching the end consumer. So we'll take a quick pause here for any questions from the group.
Great, thank you for that overview and all of the resources to help new processors figure out what hazards to focus on. So we'll open it up for questions. Feel free to write in. And to start off with, we'll just kind of loop back around to the beginning. Erin, you had asked kind of what folks in the other category were producing. And we had some people write in. We have some folks out there that are doing fresh packed produce, some apples and pears, as well as coffee. So different operations out there. And I think to start off with, one of the challenges I have heard sort of processors that are newer processors that are new to food safety and hazard analysis plans, one thing they may do is they'll do their research and then they'll sort of view everything as a hazard, and they'll have a really long list of hazards, and then they have to go through and put preventative controls for all of their hazards. So I was wondering sort of what guidance would you give to newer processors to, you know, do a thorough assessment of the hazards so that they're producing safe food, but also not go overboard so they have this sort of very unruly food safety plan.
I will say the first time I took a class on hazard analysis, I did the exact same thing. I flagged everything as a hazard requiring a control. So I think it's, you know, I think it's really common just to start out. And I've done a number of trainings since, and, you know, everyone has that struggle, you know, how do you make that determination? And, you know, the first thing I would recommend, if you haven't attended a course on hazard analysis, if you hadn't attended the Preventive Controls Qualified Individual course, that's really useful. It'll help kind of frame things that are, you know, going to be covered by GMPs. You know, if you're flagging a hazard that, you know, is coming in on human hands or something like that, you know, those are typically things that are going to be controlled by good manufacturing practices. And as long as you're implementing those, it's not something you need to elevate to requiring the preventive control, which has, you know, so much documentation associated with it. You know, the time, the resources, you know, you do want to, you know, address everything, but I would, you know, say focus in on what is really kind of the most critical thing to control. And I know that's really, you know, hard to do when you're new to the process. So again, I think attending some of those classes, looking at those guidance documents from FDA, looking at existing examples of food safety plans that are out there that might help you, you know, make that distinction between, you know, this is something I definitely need a preventive control for, whereas this, you know, I think, sure, I could list that as a hazard, but is it really something that's gonna show up in my product consistently? And you know, I think, you know, looking at those examples will give you some framing about how to make that justification that you don't need the preventive control. So that's one of the pieces of the hazard analysis. So, you know, you flag all of these hazards, and then you have to say, yes, no, it needs a control, and then justify that decision. I see a lot of people flag, you know, pesticides and raw produce that they're receiving. And, you know, if that's a domestically produced product, you know, we have regulations that restrict levels of pesticides. And, you know, I know there are issues there too, but if you look at a lot of these model food safety plans, that'll be flagged as a hazard. And then it'll say, no, this does not require preventive control because this product was produced in the United States in adherence with, our pesticide regulations. Yeah, so I think if you can attend a course on it, great. If that's not possible, there's examples of these food safety plans out there. And I think the FDA hazard guide is a really good place to kind of reference and start from too. I don't know if Stephanie maybe has some other suggestions, but it's really hard the first time you do it.
Erin, no, I think your recommendations are right on. There's always potential, hazard for all sorts of different things. So really focusing in on the ones that are going to be most likely hazards and not, going too far afield is going to be important. So, yeah.
Great, thank you. So I think we'll continue on with the rest of the presentation, but again, if questions come up and folks want to write those in, feel free to, and we'll loop back around to those at the end.
All right. So a lot of talk about hazard analysis. It's the hardest part and it's the most important part. So once you've worked through that process and you have determined that you have hazards that require preventive controls, you need to define those preventive controls within the food safety plan. And so I already mentioned the 4 different kinds of preventive controls. So our process preventive controls, these would be analogous to critical control points under the HACCP system. So these are the things that you're doing as a processor to minimize a hazard. So this could be cooking for a specific time or temperature, needing to adjust the pH or water activity to a specific level. And the documentation you would need for that particular preventive control are what we call critical limits. So these are the specific parameters that need to be achieved to control the hazard. And for our process preventive controls, you also need a validation study, which is either work done by you, your business internally, or by others in the field that show that the specific parameters of that process control address the hazard that you identified. So this can be a really difficult piece for a small processor. For some more traditional type products, that information is probably available to you. You may need to work with a consultant or someone in extension to help point you to some of those resources that you can use to be part of your validation study. You'll also, you'll have to be doing some internal work to just make sure that, you're achieving the temperature and time that's required. But just know that can be a significant chunk of work if, this is a more novel product type. The allergen preventive controls, these are established really to ensure that appropriate allergen containing labels are placed on an allergen product, and specific details on how you're going to be doing that need to be written down. So this can be, when you're receiving labels or if you have pre-label packaging coming in, just making sure that allergen is on the package. And then also when that food is placed in the final package, making sure that the appropriate label was applied. Sanitation preventive controls are rigorous cleaning and sanitation processes that are aiming to control for environmental pathogens like Listeria Monocytogenes or prevent allergen cross contact. So these go beyond the GMP requirements for cleaning and sanitation. So you're going to be doing that already as part of your prerequisite programs, routinely cleaning and sanitizing your equipment, your facility. But if you've identified either one of the environmental pathogens, Listeria Monocytogenes or Salmonella, or if you have a unique allergen in a particular product and you're running other products that don't contain that same allergen, you need to establish these sanitation preventive controls to address those issues. And then the supply chain preventive controls are those where you've identified a hazard in an ingredient, but you're relying on a supplier to control that particular hazard. So if I'm buying pasteurized liquid eggs to incorporate into a product, I'm relying on the supplier of those pasteurized eggs to control certain hazards in that product. And if I'm implementing a supply chain preventive control, you need documentation on the process that supplier is using. You're going to want to, do inspections, audits of that supplier. And you would probably require them to supply test results to you, ensuring that that hazard is being controlled, but you internally would also want to routinely do your own testing to make sure that hazard has been mitigated. And so the supply chain preventive control, it can be challenging depending on the supplier you're working with, the size of their business. And so, there are some guidance documents out there related to this subject that could also be useful if that's a hurdle that you've run into. A recall plan is required for any product where one hazard requiring a preventive control is identified. And it's basically outlining what you do when something has gone wrong and you need to get product back. So there's a fairly comprehensive example of a recall plan in the Food Safety Preventive Controls Alliance, Preventive Controls Qualified Individual Manual. And you can download that manual for free. So the recall plan is on page 344 of the English manual. And I have here just the screenshot of the table of contents to give you an example of the content that is recommended to include in the recall plan. So important to have a recall team defined, a strategy for communication with regulatory agencies, your customers, the general public. You also, want to have processes for identifying what products, lot codes, volumes, etc., are being recalled. This is where it also becomes really important that you do have a robust traceability system that allows you to connect to all parties that may have your product. And then finally, you also have to include a plan for what to do with a product that's recalled. So there's a couple of different options. If this is something that's recalled due to allergen mislabeling, you may be able to get all that product back, put the correct label on the product, and that goes back out for sale. In other cases, you may be destroying that product, unfortunately. So you do need to have, written procedures for, how that determination is made and the specific actions that are going to take place. The remaining section of the food safety plan is everything that's needed to implement the plan. And so this could include validation studies for your process preventive controls. It is also going to include all the records that you're going to be generating for monitoring the preventive controls. And so the record keeping piece is really important here. working with smaller processors records, it's really one of the things that comes up a lot as something that's needed. There's also verification activities that need to occur to make sure that those preventive controls are being implemented. So that could be going back and reviewing monitoring records, making sure that monitoring was done. It can be calibration of different equipment used for monitoring, things of that nature. And then any corrective actions also need to be included as part of this documentation. And so these corrective actions are defined actions that were taken when a preventive control was not properly implemented. And so it's basically what happened, what was done to correct it, and why that issue occurred at all. And so it's what happened, how you fixed it, and then how you're making sure it's not happening again by making a change. And so this food safety plan does need to be prepared by a preventive controls qualified individual, or PCQI. And so the Food Safety Preventive Controls Alliance developed the standardized curriculum for this particular training. And so that's the manual that contains the recall plan I just referred you to. There's a couple of different delivery modalities now, but it's a 2.5-day in-person course. There's also a hybrid option where you take kind of the chapters online and do one day in person. So that's kind of, I would say, the most frequent way that people get that PCQI designation. Someone that's been in the industry for a number of years may also qualify as the preventive controls qualified individual based on their experience, but I advise people to take the course and have that certificate in hand. And so the PCQI, or the preventive controls qualified individual, can be someone external from your business and develops the plan for you. As I already mentioned, I think there are some drawbacks to having someone outside of your business that doesn't know the product, the day-to-day operations as well, develop the plan. They may miss things or mischaracterize even what you're doing. I've seen a lot of very generic food safety plans that don't necessarily reflect what's actually happening in the process. So if possible, I would recommend that someone in-house attends this training. They may not be able to fully build out the plan on their own, but I think they need to have, a strong hand in making sure, if we're working with a consultant or someone external, that the information is reflective of the business activities. And so this preventive controls qualified individual needs to prepare the food safety plan. They also need to be the ones that are involved in the validation of those process preventive controls. So those studies or gathering data that support that process preventive control actually controls the hazard that was identified. They also need to be involved in records review and also reanalysis of the food safety plan. So the food safety plan is not kind of a one and done deal. You have to go back and periodically review it. Can't remember if it's 2 or 3 years, but kind of on that routine basis to make updates. And then anytime there's a recall, you're always going to have to reanalyze the food safety plan and update it as well. And so as a food processing facility, regardless if you're fully covered or a qualified facility, you do have to register with the FDA as a food processing facility. This registration is required to be renewed every 2 years, and they do that on the even year. Just to be aware of that. And you can do that all online now, which is the preferred method, but I believe you can still download forms and mail those into FDA as well. Generally, the type of information that's going to be required, name of the operation, where it's located, the types of products that are being produced in that facility. So you're also, in conjunction with registering with FDA, there's also the state requirements, which we went through a few webinars ago as well. So you'll need to register as a food processing facility with Washington State Department of Ag. They have a really great website that I think gives a lot of very clear guidance on how to walk through that process. I would say you're going to be providing the state a lot more detail about your food processing business compared to what you need to provide to FDA, but just know you'll have the federal registration as well as state registration and requirements. And so, there's always questions, how often is FDA going to be in my facility? So I think important to note here that in Washington, the State Department of Ag is going to be doing these inspections. The frequency, I would say, it's going to be related to the type of product you're manufacturing. So there's different levels of risks associated with different types of products. It's probably also going to be tied to how previous inspections have gone. And so if there's a significant findings in an inspection, you can expect inspectors to be in that facility more frequently. I think it's actually a huge benefit to have the state inspectors coming into facilities. We have a similar scheme here in California, but just be aware, this might be annual, it might be every 3 years or so, just depending on the product you're making, the facility, and kind of the workload of the inspectors as well. But certainly if there's any kind of issue, recall, outbreak, you're going to have folks in your facility reacting to those issues. And so there's all kinds of different violations that can be noted. And here I just wanted to kind of highlight some of the things that have been flagged that I think are really relevant to small processors. I think facility is a big one. So making sure the food processing facility is constructed in a way, so floors, ceilings, walls, that enables for cleaning and sanitation. Making sure there's a effective pest exclusion mechanisms in place, so screens on windows, things like that. And then I think just a lot of issues related to record keeping and monitoring. So sanitation monitoring is going to be, a big one. So this is something really, really important for showing that you're implementing these good manufacturing practices, having standard operating procedures for those processes, and then having the records that show that the cleaning and sanitation was happening at a frequency as outlined in those standard operating procedures. And then, all the records associated with the food safety plan implementation. And so there's going to be a lot of paperwork. But I think especially for smaller scale processors, inspectors are flagging lack of records as one of the findings that keeps coming up time and time again. So, I don't have any numbers on costs of Washington state inspections. I think, from FDA and at least from California's kind of approach, the routine inspections are at no cost to the processor, but if there is a need for a follow-up inspection because of findings that would be at the cost of the processor, So just keep that in mind. I will also say that our state inspectors, they're not allowed to consult with you, meaning they can't tell you exactly if there's an issue, how to fix it, but they will point you in directions. And oftentimes I am that direction. I imagine Stephanie is also that direction in Washington, but they do try and work with you and, fix issues during that inspection as well. So I would say, don't look at it as adversarial at all, kind of, look at it as an opportunity to collaborate, work together, learn from each other. I think that goes a long way to alleviating the stress of an inspection, but also helps facilitate some of that conversation that I think is really important for smaller processors starting out. And so just to kind of wrap up here, some useful food safety resources here, the guidance document from FDA on potential hazards in foods and processes, and then that preventive controls qualified individual manual. It has the recall plan. It also has a model food safety plan, template records and things. So it's I think a really useful tool. There's also a lot of really great resources for organic processors in particular. So beyond the food safety requirements, you also have the requirements of the organic program. So CCOF has some great resources, and then Washington State as well. So if you are an organic processor and need some further guidance on the kinds of record keeping and supply chain documentation that's required, these are some really useful places to go for that. So we'll open it up to questions again.
Great, thank you. So I think to start off with, since record keeping is something that, as you mentioned, that folks struggle with a lot, do you have any recommendations for record keeping for processors for food safety? And Stephanie, sort of specifically to Washington State, are there good resources you can point people to?
Yeah, definitely. If you need assistance with that, feel free to reach out to WSU Extension. So we have processing specialists here on the Pullman campus. It's more, we're more than happy to help you and point you in the right direction with that. With regard to record keeping, you just want to make sure that that you are keeping those records for 2 years from the date that the record was generated. And then you also want to make sure that the records are going to be working for your facility, that they're in a form that's going to work for your facility with regard to whether you're keeping paper documentation or electronic records. If you're keeping electronic records, you want to make sure that they're backed up in some way, because again, you need to be able to produce those records upon request and be able to maintain them for 2 years. But, there's a lot of different resources available online from, different, from Extension, other universities, from, different groups and industry groups, agencies that can help you, with establishing your own records. You want to make sure that, again, that they are specific for your facility, but there are a lot of templates available for use that you can modify to fit your facility.
Great, thank you. Erin, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, and I just to reiterate Stephanie's point, making sure that whatever format you choose works for your facility. I think making it as easy as possible for people to maintain and update those records is really important. So there are some examples in that manual from FSPCA. I think there's a lot of examples available through university extension as well. But again, you can use whatever format you like that works best for you. The important thing is that, if it's paper record, that it's in ink, it's legible. You of course want to do the documentation, the signing when the activity is actually happening. Provide a level of detail that's appropriate for the activity as well. There are examples as well of, what's considered a okay record versus a really good one that maybe has a higher level of detail. But, I think put some thought into it and work with what's going to be the most easy to implement, use in your facility. But I hear it all the time from inspectors: if you didn't write it down, it didn't happen. So without that written form or electronic record, you may try and plead your case, but you need to have that documented somewhere.
Great, thank you. And I know I've heard on the organic record keeping side, because again, that's something that folks struggle with organic as well, is in terms of staff training, that I've heard good feedback on, because why am I filling out this form every time I'm doing this thing? This is like super annoying. So some folks have found that kind of giving an overview and kind of like, this is why we're doing it. This is how it fits into the bigger picture. This is so that we're producing, safe organic food for our customers. And this is kind of your role in that. Also helps kind of, okay, now I kind of get why I have to sign every time I'm doing this as well. Well, good. And then another thing to kind of talk about a little more, could you go into a little more depth about supplier verification forms and kind of that process and what might be needed in terms of food safety?
Yeah. So this, if you're a smaller processor, supplying, you're getting produce from a very small scale grower, that maybe isn't subject to the produce safety rule under the Food Safety Modernization Act, maybe doesn't have, any kind of food safety certification. I would say there are ways to address that. I think from your business side, you want to make sure that any supplier that you're working with is implementing food safety procedures and you have some standardization there. So I did some work in collaboration with Community Alliance with family farmers to develop a guidance document for folks that were working with smaller scale growers to source ingredients and kind of the procedures, the documentation that would be required in this case. And it's, essentially a letter from the supplier stating that they're exempt from the regulation, but they're implementing food safety practices, and having that documentation. Another kind of best practice is to visit your supplier, if you have the opportunity to go on the farm, do a walkthrough, talk through, that's preferable. For facilities that are, subject to these more rigorous food safety regulations that are larger in scale, those requirements get a little bit more stringent. So you would need to do, so if I'm sourcing some kind of processed ingredient from a supplier, either someone internally would need to go to that facility and do a food safety audit, or we have to hire someone to do a food safety audit of that facility, have that documentation in our own food safety plan to show that, yes, we did the supplier verification to make sure these folks are following food safety regulations. They're implementing the controls they told us they were implementing. Another piece of that program would be having some certificates of conformance or certificates of analysis showing that, maybe not every lot, maybe every lot, depending, how much product you're running, just showing that that particular hazard isn't present in the product. You would probably also do some level of your own internal testing of those ingredients. But you need to have, the written procedure for how you're verifying the supplier, as well as the supporting documentation in the food safety plan. So it can be very labor intensive, and it can be, or it can feel like a barrier if you're working with smaller suppliers, but there is a way to address that as well. It's just a little different than what you might hear in some of the PCQI training and things.
Great, thank you. So I think we're gonna start to wrap things up. Again, Erin and Stephanie, thanks so much. I'll give you a moment. Are there any final words you'd like to say before we move on to our last part of the webinar?
If there's, feel free to reach out to us. I'll speak for Stephanie too, but if there's, more questions, you need more, assistance in understanding the regulations, guidance, where to go, we're resources here. You'll get our contact information, so don't be shy.
Great, thank you. And actually, we had one final question come in, and since we have a couple minutes, why don't we go ahead and address that? And someone was wondering, is having the supplier's third-party audit certification on file enough to cover supplier verification?
I think that is a piece of it. I'm assuming this is a grower. I don't know. I don't want to make an incorrect assumption, but if you're working with a grower and they have some type of food safety third-party audit, that essentially is what you need. If it's a food processor, I would also be asking, in addition to some of that third-party audit certification, other information from them, like a certificate of acceptance, essentially testing results showing that they're controlling the hazard. But generally, that's kind of the basic requirement. And for growers, you're not going to do routine testing of produce. That's not recommended practice. So having that audit report sufficient.
Great, thank you. All right, so I think we're gonna wrap up with one last poll. And as Erin mentioned, this webinar is part of a series of trainings that we're collaborating with Erin and Stephanie and the Washington Department of Agriculture on. So we just wanted to kind of tap your brain, see what other types of trainings you would like to see. And we will consider this as we develop future programming. So if you want to go ahead, click in, see what types of training you would like to see in the future. And I see there's some coming in, and they're kind of a good diversity. People are looking at produce safety training, also basic good manufacturing practices. So I'll give folks a couple more seconds to fill out the form, and then I'll go ahead and end the poll. So yeah, I think this gives us a good snapshot on the types of trainings people are looking for, and I think we've seen similar results in other webinars. So thank you very much for sharing that with us. And we'll, if you are signed up with the CCOF e-newsletter or in contact with WSDA or UC Davis or Washington State University, we will get out the information about those upcoming trainings. And so just speaking of upcoming trainings, we do have a training on current good manufacturing practices coming up in December. And so feel free to sign up for those, and there's more information on the CCOF website. And in addition to that, Erin, do you want to talk a little bit about your feedback opportunity?
Yeah, just really briefly, I'm working to develop some online food safety training to kind of serve as a stand-in for some of the, employee training requirements that there are under these regulations. And right now we're looking for feedback on content areas for this online training. So if your job has anything to do with food safety program and administration, we'd love to hear from you. The grad student on the project's contact information is here, but you can reach out to me as well if you're interested. So we're just looking to sit down with you for less than an hour, have a chat, and we'll compensate you for your time if you're willing to share your perspectives with us. So thanks in advance.
Great, thank you. And you can also find past webinars and other trainings on the CCOF YouTube channel, and the links there will be sending out the slides so you can access it through that. And CCOF Foundation is also has some of our grant opportunities open. If you have a high school or middle school student in your life who's involved with FFA, the Future Organic Farmer Grant Program is accepting applications for organic focused FFA projects. So there's more information on the CCOF website, and it's really inspiring every year to see all of the enthusiastic young youth and all of their great projects. So we look forward to seeing those again this year. And with that, we'll wrap things up. Thank you again to Erin and Stephanie and Marissa for being here today. And as you close out of the webinar, an evaluation form will pop up, and please take a minute or two to fill it out and give us some feedback and ideas for future programming. So thanks again, and have a good afternoon or good morning. We're still in the morning. Goodbye.